1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 25 minutes before 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. One of the things that I've said as a statement of hope is that I hope we as a human race can become more peaceful and more understanding by realizing that the troubles in this world, and I'm going to make a statement that you might disagree with, but the troubles in this world come from the governments and not necessarily from the people. And so with the people, the average person having the ability with today's technology, Facebook, Twitter, etc., with them having that ability, a kid here in Central Florida can be online chatting with a kid maybe in Iran or in China or anywhere and realize that kid's really not that different than him. They're kind of the same, and they've got the same worries and the same hopes for the future. And next thing you know, they're going to be saying, I don't understand why our two countries are at war or having troubles with each other. It doesn't make any sense. And so I've often thought that the hope of our future might be in the hearts of young people, is providing that the governments they live under don't take away their ability to communicate. Because can you imagine World War II, right? We found out about things happening in World War II only through the news media. We had no way of really communicating with anybody anywhere. We had to depend on talking heads, so to speak. Zach Dychtwald is on the phone. He has written a book called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. I think he's right. Zach has put a lot of work into this. He is an accomplished writer, a consultant, a public speaker. He has traveled extensively throughout 5 continents to explore what makes people and cultures tick, and I'm guessing he has seen firsthand what I'm trying to express. He has searched for glimpses into the future, and I can't wait to hear what he has to tell us about what he discovered. Zach Dychtwald, good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Larry and Robin.
You're welcome. Where are you right now? Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from New York, actually. So I'm here while the book comes out. It's coming out in the United States, and then I will be going back to China about in a month or so.
When was the first time you went to China?
The first time I stepped foot in China was 2011. Actually, the first day of 2011, I was an exchange student, and it was a sort of revelatory experience. I went there, as goofy as this sounds, because I was a big science fiction fan.
Oh, really?
I wanted to see where the future was happening. I figured I could study abroad in Europe and see history, or I could go to China and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. So
why
I figured I'd go and check it out for myself.
Why does it seem to me, and I don't know that I'm alone in this, but I'm guessing I'm not, why does it seem that we have somewhat of a feeling of we know what life might be like for the average British person or the average German person or the average French person, but we really don't seem to know about the average Chinese person? Why is that?
A lot of what we focus on, the stories that come out of China, are focused on the government, sort of like you brought up in the introduction. I actually think you make a great point. When you focus on the government or when you focus on macroeconomics, it's really easy to imagine an adversarial relationship with China. Yeah. And so few of the stories focus on people, and if they do focus on people, it's scintillating stories. You imagine a population that sort of eats dog meat but also drives Lamborghinis. They can be they're living in ghost towns. They're building these cities where no one will be moving in, but they also have to be shoved on subways. So you have this conflicting idea of what the people could look like.
Yeah.
It's based on the extraordinary. I focus in this book on the ordinary.
I've often wondered if it's not the written language. In the written language in Europe, for the most part, we can sound it out. Maybe we know a few words. We can sort of kind of relate to it. But the written language in the Asian world, Asian countries, unless you've studied it, you don't even know what you're looking at.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt. So there's tens of thousands of characters in Chinese. And you can't read it off the page the same way you could if you know the English alphabet. You just sound it out in English. In Chinese, if you don't know that specific character, you can't read it off the page. It's a culturally and linguistically distant country, far more so than most European countries.
Is there a battle between the young people that are in China now and the elderly population in China? Are traditions still followed?
It's a great question because right now, I call them the restless generation, and they are at the fault line of two great tectonic plates, sort of how I imagine it. On one hand, they have tradition, sort of what you're talking about, what it means to be Chinese, what it's always meant to be Chinese. And on the other side, you have the pressures of modernity, this emerging millennial mindset, this plugged-in, internet-driven, more global, cosmopolitan idea of what it means to be a young person in the world. Those two tectonic plates are grinding against each other. And this young generation is sort of deciding what it means to be Chinese in the modern world.
I wonder if, because we have so lack of understanding of what's happening in North Korea, and I would imagine that the average North Korean just wants to live his or her life also, and it sounds like they don't have really good opportunity to do that. How did China go from, I don't know that China was ever like North Korea, so I'm kind of making a presumption here. But everything pointed to that it once was. How did it go from being North Korean-like to being like almost like Western culture-like? How did that change?
Well, you're not wrong in that China in the 1950s and the 1960s was behind a cultural wall. Their only understanding of the United States was slogans: catch up with the United States, surpass the United States, or sometimes a calendar hanging on the wall, Fields of Europe. That was their view of the West, 12 pictures. But after 1980 specifically, when China opened up to outside investment, opened up to outside business, China began to interact with the world. Now this young generation in China is global. They grow up watching our TV. They grow up watching our movies. I have friends in China who can quote Barney from How I Met Your Mother and Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, wow.
They have an understanding and interaction with the West that is so far and away beyond what the older generation could even comprehend that when you're talking with an older person in China, it feels like time travel and not just going back to, the 60s. It feels like going back to the 1800s. That's how large the generation gaps are in China.
Wow. And so did your vision of what you were hoping for take place? Do you sort of have a view of the future?
You can begin to imagine the impact that this young generation is going to have. The millennials in China, there's 400 million of them. There's a big to-do about American millennials, but there's only 80 million of us. So in terms of economic and political clout, understanding this young generation, who they are, what they want, what they dream of, what keeps them up at night, that's going to have major implications for not just the global economy, but also for your local economy. Down in Florida, who's buying up real estate? Which are the tourists that are coming in? Who's crowding the local universities and paying full tuition? Mm-hmm. It's having a major impact on a very local level.
Yeah, and what we have here, obviously, is Disney World, and you do see that there. You see it a lot, and that's because they're suddenly having money, and yet you hear about, you hear about the iPhone, for example, being assembled in China, and being assembled by people who are basically slaves. How true is that part of the story we're hearing?
Well, China is a manufacturing nation. It was never slavery, but remember that as recently as 1990, China's per capita GDP was $300. So the average wage in China, we would consider it something almost akin to working for nothing. But what's also so interesting about that, I was born in 1990, so I'm 27, about to turn 28. In my lifetime, I've watched the per capita GDP in the United States increase 2.5 times, which is remarkable, particularly for a developed country.
Right.
In China, someone my same age has watched the per capita GDP increase 25 times. So in the last 27 years, the amount of change that China has witnessed, it is quite literally a rags to riches story without real comparison in the modern world, just the scale and speed of it. So it used to be that way in China. It used to be that they were a manufacturing country. This young generation will not be making the world's shirts. They are pushing to become innovators.
Yeah, and to that, I think one of the manufacturing plants of the iPhone recently announced that they would not be using human labor. They're using robots. So I don't know what effect that's going to have. But the whole world is changing. I love your view. I love the fact that you yourself are young and you're seeing these changes. I know that it's impossible for a young person here, I guess, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I think it's impossible to communicate with a young person in North Korea, for example. But I hope that changes, because I really think that's it. I think the same thing with the Middle East. I don't know why the Israeli kids don't start chatting with the Arab kids, or whatever we're calling the other side, Palestinian children. I mean teenagers, I don't mean children, and saying, you know what, these guys running our countries are just ruining everything. They're throwing bombs at each other, and they're recruiting us to wars, and they're baiting everything with religion or with politics or with money, and it's all for their own benefit, and it doesn't benefit any of the soldiers who end up dying on the field.
Human connection, beyond government, just person-to-person connection, I agree with you, Larry, is the key to it all. In my book, I almost didn't write about government at all, except for how this young generation has to interact with their government. I've wanted to focus on the human side of things, because I truly believe that good relationships are based on understanding. Understanding this young generation, what they're afraid of, what they hope for themselves, their family, I think that's going to bring our two countries and people closer. Versus focusing on the government.
Yeah, I think you're right. And does the government filter what the average person knows about the West, or not in China?
You can't deny that there is censorship in China. I will say, though, and this is an interesting and important point, it's not censored to the extent that the average American typically thinks. And I don't want to be too presumptuous here, but sort of like I said, I have friends who grew up with... They had studied 10 years of English. The average person in China my age has studied 10 years of English. So they are reading foreign books. I have friends who've read 1984. So when we're comparing China to that sort of civilization, they can be like, well, actually, not quite. They've grown up watching our TV. They watch our movies. 1 in 3 students studying abroad in the United States are from China. 1 in 3. A massive number. So there is more communication. There is far more understanding than we give this young generation credit for. I would even say that China understands us, and this young generation understands us far more than the average young person in the United States understands China, which, by the way, is in part China's fault.
And throughout your experience of you traveling all over China, you've had the opportunity to live in different areas, from tenements to high-rises, and you've interviewed so many people. How receptive were they in your asking them the questions?
Amazingly receptive. I think we imagine China as being closed off, sort of a big brother communist country, but I would sit down with people. They'd invite me into their homes without a second's hesitation. The guest-host relationship is so intact in China, particularly when people see that you speak the language. You spent the time to try to understand who they are and where they're coming from. I truly have never been better received in a country, really anywhere in the world. So it's incredibly warm, incredibly welcoming, and incredibly open, surprisingly so.
I don't know if this question is going to go anywhere, but is there anything morally dividing? Do they have different views on sexuality or sex itself, or even on food, and what's the proper way to eat, or even the right things to eat? Like, you always hear about people eating dogs in other countries, and that would appall an American, or horse meat in France, I think, right, Robin?
Yes, I would think so.
So, I mean, are there any of those cultural or morality things that might stand in the way or need to be ironed out?
Well, I'm going to do some high-level ones, and I'm going to do some fun ones, if that's okay, some more day-to-day stuff. On a high level, China's not religious. China does not have a history of religion. It does have family. It does have Confucianism. For instance, this really comes to bear when you talk about homosexuality in China, which is something I do talk about. And so the opposition to homosexuality is not based in sin. It's based in where's our next generation going to come from? How are you going to form what we imagine in China to be a family unit? Where's our son? Where's our daughter? So that's an interesting divide. The outcomes are often similar, but it's a different perspective. On a day-to-day level, we my Chinese friends, they are currently redefining global travel. They're actually the biggest force in the travel market. One of the biggest issues they have, though, is when there's no Chinese food. My friends say if we go 3 days without having Chinese food, we just can't cope.
All right, can I put you on pause just to ask you what you mean by that? I mean, if I go to the Chinese restaurant here in Florida, will it be similar to what they're talking about, or is it two different foods?
I hate to break it to you, Larry, but it's just not the same.
Oh, okay.
Most of the chefs who live from China, who live in the United States, because of immigration patterns, are from one of two places, so Fujian province or Guangdong. And those are two very unique styles of food. So if you're from Beijing, which is in the north, if you're from Sichuan, which is where I lived, a lot of these guys have never even been there. So when we think of Sichuanese food, most of the chefs have never been to the province where that food originates. So I have trouble finding food that, I love Chinese food. I particularly love food from Chengdu, which is where I lived for a lot of the time. And I, even in New York, struggle to find what we would consider authentic Sichuanese and Chengdunese food.
Really?
Yeah, it's something that you wouldn't expect.
You know what's interesting? We went to a Chinese restaurant here, and we developed a friendship with two of the waitresses there at the restaurant, and they were like straight from China. They hardly spoke English, and they all had smartphones. And so I was asking them, what is life like where you're from? I'm just curious. And so they figured out what I was trying to ask them. They were really happy about me asking them, by the way. And then they got out their smartphones and they found some photographs. And I'm looking at a city that I'm thinking, wow, that looks like here. I saw a KFC in the picture. There was, I totally blown away. I was so still in whatever imagery I had in my mind, probably from some old movies. It wasn't like that at all.
Right. Well, again, China's changed so much and so fast that 10 years ago, China looked like a developing nation. But if you go to Shanghai now, particularly if you look at some of the technology that they're using, or if you ride the subway or something like that, it's a totally modern nation. In fact, in certain areas, for instance, the app space in China, I don't know if you guys have you guys heard of the app WeChat?
WeChat. I don't know if I have or not. I'm getting new to app. I'm kind of old, just so you know.
No worries. Well, I'm happy to explain it to you because it is. A lot of people in the tech space think that the Chinese app WeChat, which is made by the company Tencent, is the best app in the world.
Really?
I can explain a little bit of the functionality if that would help.
Absolutely. I'm going to do it because I'm an app guy now. I became an app guy in October.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome to the club.
Welcome to the century.
Right, well, I'll add you on WeChat. So, all right. So, Larry and Robin, say we are going to dinner. We're in China. We're going to dinner. I can, through WeChat, send you a text the way I would on iMessage. It also works sort of like WhatsApp. I could also give you a call or a video call like on Skype, saying, okay, we're going to go to this restaurant and eat there. It also has the functionality of Yelp, so I could choose restaurants and search for restaurants in the local area. Like I said, I like Sichuanese food, so maybe I'll find a Sichuanese restaurant. I will then send the location of that restaurant through WeChat to the two of you. I still haven't left the app. I will then call you guys a car because you guys are my guests in Sichuan. In the same way I would use an Uber, I still haven't left the app. I'm going to drive there.
Oh, wow.
I will order food through the app. I will find a sort of Groupon type deal, like a coupon type deal, and use that. I still haven't left the app. I will take pictures. We'll take some selfies because, hey, we're millennials. Larry and Rob, when you guys are hanging with me, you guys are part of the millennial crew. I will share the picture as I would on Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat through the app. I'll then pay through the app, and if I've had a little bit too much to drink, I could even order. I could ask somebody in the same way I would an Uber to come to the restaurant. He'll arrive on a scooter and drive me in my car back to my apartment so that I don't have to drive drunk. I've still not left the app. The functionality is amazing.
I just found
it. Far surpasses anything we have here.
I just found it online. Okay, I'm going to be a WeChat. I'm going to do the WeChat thing, Robert.
Welcome, add me.
Since you are the founder of the Young China Global Group, do you have the millennials from China that are here in the United States and they occasionally venture back and forth from China to here, and the millennials in China venture from China, to here, and vice versa?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. A lot of the friends that I have in China and in the United States who are from China go back and forth all the time. 2/3 of all passport holders in China are under the age of 35. So this young generation is far more global than anything that we've ever really seen.
Wow. Does those wages, like when they find out what our wages are do they put up what's a good word, Robin? Do they protest? Do they say, "Hey, we need to make more money over here," or is that not happening? I'm trying to get a grip on
absolutely. that. So one of the part of being the restless generation, there's a striving that comes with it. So the expectations of what it means to be a good life at this point in time in China are racing fast. So they're rising fast, trying to find a wage that can keep pace with those expectations. An iPhone still costs a month and a half of the average wage. So say I'm making, in New York, I think it's fairly common to make $40,000 a year if you have a college degree. And so you might, you'll be able to afford an iPhone, and you can just, if you're able to save up for a month, you could still pay rent, you could still have food, and you're packing sandwiches every day, and that's fine. In China, if you don't pay rent, if you don't eat, if you don't take the subway, you still can't afford an iPhone over the course of a month.
Oh
so there's
gosh.
a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what you think you should have, what comes with a modern life, and what you're often able to afford. With that being said, the tech startups in Beijing, some of these young people are starting to get paid big, starting to get paid a developed wage. But the per capita GDP in China is still around $10,000 or even a little bit lower. So it's not at the level of a developed country and the developed wages that we've come to expect.
We know that a few years ago, when the elderly wasn't able to live by themselves, then they would move in with the younger generation, so on and so on. Is that still happening in China today? Are they still taking care of their peers?
Well, it's a great question, because in China, traditionally, the retirement system is your children. It's something called the Fanbo Moshi. It means the return and feed model. So parents would take care of their children until they were ready to leave the nest. The so-called baby bird, as they got older, will then come back to the nest and look after their parents into old age. But in 1950, that was particularly easy because the average life expectancy was only 36. So you didn't retire, you died, quite literally.
Oh.
Now, because of the one-child policy and because of a massive longevity revolution, the average life expectancy has gone from 36 to 76 in around 6 decades.
Wow.
I mean, imagine that change.
Is that one-child policy still in effect? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, not at all. It's not in effect anymore, but they say urbanization is the best form of birth control. So people are still not having more than one child, at the very most 2. But there's this huge question of who will care for the old. Right now, China has what's called the 4-2-1 problem. You have 4 grandparents for every 2 parents for every 1 child. It's very difficult for this young person to look after the older generation in China. It's a major issue right now in China.
Have you addressed the issue of human trafficking over there? Is that one of the hubs?
I don't talk about it much in the book. There's obviously rumors and there's news about it. China is actually cracking down on that quite a lot, but it is not one of the major trends that I've identified, certainly. From what I understand, and again, this is just rumor at this point, where it used to run through areas like Guangzhou and Shenzhen, it's moved further into Southeast Asia. But again, these are just rumors.
Wow. Zach Dychtwald, thank you so much. I did the WeChat thing, and it was the longest contract I ever didn't read. So I have no idea what I just
signed your life away.
I don't know what I just agreed to. But you have a unique name, so I'm sure I'll be able to find you, and you'll be my first friend on that new thing. Zach,
looking forward to it.
The book is called Young China. I found it on Amazon. The picture of the cover has been on the podcast the whole time we've been talking. And real quickly, do you have a website?
Yeah, it's youngchinagroup.com, or you can just search my name, zachdykewald.com. They will all lead to my website. And everyone come, shoot me an email. I'd love to chat.
And by the way, out of the millions of books on Amazon, you are now, I think you were 28 in the subcategory of China. So, wow.
Hey now.
That's
all right.
Hey now. Hey, thank you, Zach.
Good day.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Zach, for being on the air with us, and you're an inspiration for all of us. I think you have shown us that there's a possibility that the earth will have peace. I mean, every time it's Christmas time, somebody says, "What do you want for Christmas?" I always say peace on earth. No, come on, what do you really want? Well, that is what I really want.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe you're right. Maybe this is going to be the beginnings of that. Let's hope. Zach, thank you for
Well, thank you so much for having me, Larry and Robin. It's been great to talk to you both.
Thank you. That was awesome. All right, we will take a little break. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. The House Oversight Committee has started an investigation into the controversy over a former staffer accused of abuse by his ex-wives. FBI Director Christopher Wray in sworn testimony yesterday saying his agency completed an investigation into Rob Porter.
We received requests for follow-up, and we did the follow-up and provided that information in November. We administratively closed the file in January. Earlier this month, we received some additional information, and we passed that on as well.
Some believe this contradicts the White